Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, January 14th, 2019. Still working on making sure I get that right. And school's closed, by way of update. And I don't know if they're closed where you are, but they're all closed in the D.C. area. The kids are excited. We got the call last night. And quite frankly, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary. Roads aren't in that bad a condition. But kids are, well, one of them's home anyway. The other one decided to have a sleepover elsewhere. So we might have a quiet actual background for the show. And we're, hunting around for misplaced items this morning. So it's a little bit crazy. Things are a little off kilter. But, I guess if we hear a eureka at any point, we'll know we found our lost items. And how about our lost innocence as a nation? Yes, this weekend... it was a crazy one. Trump, who hasn't left the White House in months, left the White House, of course, to have a brief press conference outside to say that he never left anywhere. That's the least of the crazy from the weekend. I have a hard time even getting my head around it all at this point. We'll depend on Greg Dworkin to help us do the roundup. It's just too much. I mean, I don't know. I spent the better part of the weekend trying to decide whether I should be reacting to what was in my Twitter feed and in the news feed with yes, absolutely, or freaking duh, where have you been? I can't believe you're only coming up with this now. Over the weekend, do I have to tell you what the major stories are? I mean, I don't think I really need to remind anybody, but I guess just to set the scene for today, we saw a couple of major news outlets, Washington Post, New York Times, Newsweek also finally following up on this thing. I guess it was the New York Times that led the way, ironically enough, considering how far astray they led us originally, if you had been listening to the New York Times at the time, which most of us weren't, thankfully. But I guess the big bombshell thing was, what's the date of the piece here? Was it the 11th? That's Friday. So I guess Friday afternoon. Adam Goldman, Michael Schmidt, and Nicholas Fandos, who came up with this piece. FBI opened inquiry into whether Trump was secretly working on behalf of Russia. And that led us to a number of similar pieces from other outlets, which, like I said, was half like, yes, of course, hallelujah, they finally are on this, and oh my God, duh, we all knew this for the longest time. How is it that you're only now willing to come to this conclusion? And of course, for the New York Times in particular, it's not really ironic, but the difficulty we have in crediting the New York Times for their work was, of course, they were the ones that handed us the pre-election headline of, hey, there's really no evidence whatsoever of anything with this Russia deal, according to the FBI, and nothing to see here. Everybody go home, which for the New York Times, when they do that sort of thing, not that it affected the vote in Manhattan very much, I'm sure. I don't even know if it affected anybody's vote, but I guess there's certainly room out there somewhere to believe that there are people in all over the country who look to the paper of record for a definitive word on this sort of thing, and they didn't get it, and we still don't have it now. But now I really don't know exactly what it is that prompted them to make the change, because I couldn't sit through the entirety of the article, which is probably bad news because I'm behind on what people are now saying in the third and fourth and fifth iterations of reactions to this article, but it was just too much to stomach at the time. There's a ton of other ones out there as well, and it has raised new/the same questions over what motivated Trump to do what he did in all of his dealings with Putin, in particular in the fake summit that he was so desperate to call a summit and to have in a Nordic country, so that he was very Reagan-esque. And, of course, Reykjavik was booked at the time, so he picked Helsinki. And we don't know what happened. Did it go well? Did it not go well? We don't know because it's a secret. He met alone with Putin for hours and had only the big story. The second round of big stories was that he was there with just his translator, maybe his translator, or maybe a translator who had been given to him, for all I know, by the Russians, or chosen from among our ranks with Russian influence. I don't know. And Putin's translator. And I don't know. They're both dead at this point. I think you might as well assume that that's going to be the case eventually. If I were that translator, I'd be hiding out. But Trump took the unusual step, let's say, of confiscating his translator's notes. I don't know how unusual it is to hold them to confidentiality / pinky swear secrecy over what transpired in the meeting. I would think that would be relatively normal, and it's a relative term at this point, since nothing else is normal. But confiscating the notes, that one I've never seen. We're also reminded, of course, Democrats now in control of the House of Representatives and the investigative bodies there, and word is that they're already seeking testimony and had already sought testimony when they were in the minority from the translator. That was, of course, immediately pushed aside by Republicans in control of the committee, but the situation is different now, to say the least, and so we'll be looking into how that affects things and seeing if there's any other news to catch up on too. As the news cycle was so crazy and infuriating, not that there were so many things happening, but just so many minor other eruptions around those two major stories that I'm having trouble keeping track of it all, and I can't even depend on my KITM hashtag to keep us up to date, because it has been occupied by the singer about whom I told you last week, and her tens of fans around the world. It's not that bad. You can absolutely get through, but I guess the big news on that front is the name of the song the singer has released is Keep It To Myself, and that's KITM. And I'm not certain what she sought to gain by asking her fans to put hashtag KITM in their usernames, because I don't think that actually works to do anything. But I guess it popularizes the hashtag among her fans. She's got a fan base. I would have expected that an international pop sensation, if that's what we were dealing with, would have overwhelmed my timeline to a much greater extent. But it has not happened, and I guess I'm glad for myself, although I wish her every success in the world. Not that it's not my kind of music, but hey. Anyway, that's a minor disruption that we'll have to deal with. All right, and I'm just picking around for the other items. Oh, here comes Greg. Well, I'll have to mute the laptop so we don't get too much of an echo there. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. So
Hi.
If you mute that person, does your hashtag then just show you what you want to see?
If I mute that person, no. I have to mute. Well, I could mute all of her fans. I probably would be able to deal with that. I think I could.
Or mute the conversation.
I don't know if I can do that. I'm not sure. I'll mute some things and we'll see what happens. I won't mute you until you're done.
Well, as my grandmother used to say, it couldn't hurt.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. That's how I'll spend the news. Because I'll spend the whole day here because I haven't left the house in months.
Oh, really? That's good.
Like Donald Trump.
Like Donald Trump. So, a couple of things to go over. When I put the pundit roundup together for this morning,
yes,
I led off with, I think, what were the four big stories of the weekend, including this morning.
All right.
And like you, of course, I started off with the FBI open inquiry into whether Trump was secretly working on behalf of Russia from the New York Times.
Well, you have to.
And then a couple from the Washington Post here. Trump concealed details of his face-to-face encounters with Putin from senior officials in administration. You're just talking about that, the translator notes that Trump confiscated. But there was a round of polling about the shutdown, which was also big. Washington Post's version of it was Americans blame Trump and GOP much more than Democrats for the shutdown, and the polls support that. And then this morning, Washington Post, with pressure on Senate Republicans to break shutdown impasse grows. One of the things that I always find fascinating about Inside the Beltway reporters and pundits is their ability to handle two completely separate sets of data points in their head and not combine them.
Oh.
You know, in this world, there were people who were lumpers and there were people who were splitters, right? So some people tend to lump everything together. Some people tend to split them into individual pieces.
Yes.
There's the people who count dots. There's the people that connect the dots. But you know, think of it this way. You have a whole series of very damaging reports about how Trump is basically reasonably accused of being a Russian asset.
Yes.
Max Boot, for example, in the Washington Post has a column here. Here are 18 reasons Trump could be a Russian asset. Doesn't prove it, but you can understand why
if he wanted to be.
The whole thing was raised, right,
okay.
As a possibility. And yet, at the same time, let's look at polling and let's game out 2020 as if Trump isn't done damage whatsoever and as if he's going to be the candidate. And then let's disparage the fact that we have 172 people on the Democratic side running. Every spectrum from Richard Ojeda in West Virginia to, what if Andrea Ocasio-Cortez runs for president?
Yes.
And everything in the middle. Right?
Please. Okay. She's constitutionally too young, and I think you should leave her alone on that.
Well, but I'm just saying.
No, I know. I'm not saying you're doing it.
I've seen that suggestion from the conservative side, who clearly are obsessed with her and very bothered by the fact that she's incredibly skilled with social media. And to that point, there's a recent tweet here that I was just fascinated by Shane Goldmacher, who was looking at engagement.
All right.
On Twitter. You know, the idea that if you post something, people will either read it or respond to it or answer you back or something like that. And, it all is relevant because we're talking about, in this particular conversation, the 2020 election.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
And while this is going on, it turns out that Donald Trump, of course, by far has the most engagement on Twitter of politicians. That's not surprising.
He has been engaged a lot. That's true.
Right. He gets like 39.8 million engagements, total interactions on Twitter.
Oh,
right.
Kind.
Half of those are bots, but that's besides the point. You know,
True. Everybody
knows you look at Trump for Twitter in the morning to get an idea what he's thinking. In second place, this is no surprise, with 11.8 million engagements is Andrea Ocasio-Cortez, known on Twitter as AOC.
All right.
Very skilled with social media. Everybody knows that. Now, in fourth place, I'm going to skip third for a moment. In fourth place is Barack Obama.
That guy.
And then we have CNN, Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, The Hill, ABC, New York Times, MSNBC, and NBC News. Okay. And Sean Hannity, the Washington Post, and Reuters, just to give you an idea of what the list is. So, would you ever have guessed who is in third place?
I don't know. Probably not. It sounds
Kamala
like
Harris.
Really?
Really. And as Shane Goldmacher points out, I know the news of the Axios chart here is AOC, but I find Kamala Harris's position just as interesting.
Yes.
If not more so. You probably can't name a tweet she has sent, and she still finished third. That
is remarkable. If you had, I guess if you had just asked originally, you'll be so surprised at who's number 3, I would have said, no, I won't. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Aha.
And she was number 2.
Yeah.
You know, so there is a Twitter out there that perhaps you don't interact with. Perhaps I don't, but it's just trying to make the point here that all the smart inside the Beltway pundits who are just trying to game out what it would take to beat an undamaged Donald Trump in 2020, as if he's undamaged, which isn't true.
I don't know what that is.
Right,
okay.
Because you have to get all these stories we were just talking about how Trump is possibly a Russian agent, and by the way, FBI, and maybe they had reason to do that, and maybe the Mueller report will be a bombshell. But you have to ignore that and say, okay, let's pretend he's not damaged, and who would best run against him in 2020? And, of course, the political pundits say, well, it has to be somebody who's engaging and good on TV and good on social media. I wonder who that can be. There isn't anybody. And you look at those numbers and say, yeah, you know what?
Well, that's the answer. And,
one of those two is actually old enough to run for president.
Right. That's the next thing. It's not that I don't
process guy,
see.
that matters, right?
Yes. Well, either yes or no. It might matter not at all. We'll figure out how to get around it by 2020. It's not that I haven't seen Kamala Harris's tweets, and they're good. But yeah, there's nothing. Certainly, there was nothing explosive. She's just good, solid. Good.
That's the thing. She's just good and solid.
So is everybody else.
She's going to make an excellent presidential candidate and has to be amongst the top three. Yeah. In terms of who's running, even though she may not have announced yet.
Yeah, unless she's somehow overshadowed in the next week by Brian Schatz, who has been tweeting up a storm and
but didn't make the list.
No, didn't make the list. It didn't happen in time, and nobody's considering for president. However, we are possibly considering him as like honorary president of the blogosphere, and he sounds more and more like a blogger every day, which I like. It's very nice. I think should be very engaging, but we'll see. He's not flirting with the presidency, so I guess you're not supposed to pay attention to him.
Right. Anyway, so getting back to what's going on, I just thought all of that was interesting. And, how could you not have the idea in your head that Trump is damaged?
I don't know how you even, that's not an exercise I could help anybody with. Pretending.
So let's look a little bit at the polling roundup then. Internet polls show same thing as telephone polls, Harry Anton points out. Who is to blame most for the shutdown? Now, some of the polls are, I think, properly combining Trump and the GOP versus Democrats.
Okay.
Others are splitting out Trump, GOP, and Democrats in a three-way. But they're like, Mitch McConnell and Trump are joined at the hip, so I don't really see how and why you would do that. But internet polls, Ipsos, GOP total to blame, 58%, Democrats 32%, Morning Consult 52-33%, YouGov 55-32%, average 55-32%, blame the GOP. Telephone polls, ABC, Washington Post 53-29%, CNN 55-32%. So they're all saying the same thing. More than 50% of the public blames Trump for this shutdown, and there's really no way to avoid it. And as far as the CNN poll goes, the increase in disapproval for the president comes primarily among whites without college degrees.
Okay.
He's 37%, and his disapproval is dropping, as well as blaming him for the shutdown. And we talked about this last week. The fact is that Midwestern farmers and others are getting hurt by the shutdown, the tariffs, and things that Trump is doing. And so, as Nate Silver points out, as he watches the poll numbers slowly drop for Trump, and they are slow, but they are dropping, and says, you know what, whoever's advising him politically that says that this is a good move for him is like crazy. These are terrible numbers for him, and they're getting worse.
Yes. So that would be Jared Kushner.
Right. In December, his approval rating with whites who have not received a four-year degree stood at 54, with 39% disapproving, and now it's 45-47. And among whites who do hold college degrees, it's unchanged, 64 disapprove and 32 approve. So whites with college degrees don't like Trump. Whites without college degrees are turning on him. Those who said, it'll never change, I've told you for a long time, it will. The evangelical base won't move, but everybody else will.
Yeah, I guess not.
Brownstein also points this out. After an election in which GOP was swept in the suburbs, new CNN poll shows 63% of college plus whites opposed the border wall, 63% mostly blame Trump for shutdown, and 64% disapprove of his job performance. A reminder that Trump's base-first politics, abetted by the GOP, carries real costs. And again, for those who say, oh, well, Trump voters will never change, they will. They have. They are. Again, it's his core base that won't change, but that's not enough to win elections.
Yeah, and it's increasingly clear that that core really is mostly limited to evangelicals and people who are able to say, I don't know what's happening, but it's God's will, so whatever.
Exactly. We need a King Cyrus, and he's it. The last remaining group of voters who still solidly support President Trump, white non-college educated men over age 45, the only group who stands firmly with the president and makes up less than 20% of the country. And if you consider them to be white evangelicals, even more so.
Evangelical soybean farmers.
The idea that things are changing is that Republicans in Congress are actually saying nasty things about Steve King, as I pointed out over the weekend. Of course, I didn't know this, and you weren't available, so I had to look it up.
Oh.
But censure only takes a majority, whereas expulsion takes 2/3.
Right. And, of course, they wouldn't. They're not going to opt for expulsion or not agree to expulsion on the Republican side.
Right, but censure is not
racist.
Off the table.
No. They spent the weekend mostly people saying we have to take action.
We have to do something.
So that would be the thing.
Right. So my question is, okay, you have to do something. You're going to teach or you're going to do research? I mean, which is it? What are you going to do? You have to stand up and do something. How about censuring the guy?
Yeah, and I imagine that's the option that they'll take. I don't know why they would agree to
what's
anything
the
else.
process for that? How do you arrange? If you decide you're a freshman, you
Yes.
just got to Congress, you know nothing. I always like to put myself in that position.
All right.
And it's the boss. So how do you arrange censure?
Run for president
Now.
first,
Right.
as everybody else is. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but you might as well just start an exploratory committee. It's by resolution.
So you don't need to go through a committee or have a ruling or anything like that. You just put a resolution on the floor?
You could.
I mean, obviously you have to do the groundwork for it, but
Yes,
from the process point of view, you just have to put it on the floor?
Yes, that would be, well, there are two ways that it might eventually reach the floor. And one, if there's an ethics violation involved, you'll want to perhaps run it through the ethics committee. Usually if there's House rules or money has changed hands in ways.
Yeah, like if you're a crook or something. Or if you found tons of cold cash in your freezer.
Right. Then there would be an ethics
recently.
committee investigation into what kind of freezer does he have? Can I get one? Things like that.
How cold is the ice? Yeah.
Right.
We got to have all the details before we decide what to do.
This way you could you could submit a resolution calling for censure and listing a bill of particulars, of complaints, and I guess what you would do then is you might suggest that the resolution was a matter of the privileges of the House, which would give it some preferred consideration. If any member were to bring a question of the privileges of the House, there would have to be a ruling after up to an hour of debate on whether or not it in fact posed a question of the privileges of the House, something that impacted the dignity of the House as a whole and the membership, and this would fit. And there are points of personal privilege as well, but this would surely go to the privileges of the House if the majority or minority leader offer that motion or that question. Then it is to be decided immediately, and then the underlying bill debated immediately, resolution debated immediately. Anyone else other than the majority or minority leader or their can then get an immediate ruling on whether or not it's properly a question of the privileges of the House. But at that point, they can defer action. They have up to a couple of days to take it up, but they can schedule it differently. I imagine if Pelosi and McCarthy are talking about it and McCarthy
might actually want to bring it up.
Yeah, he may be inclined to bring a censure, and she may say, yeah, that's your prerogative. Go ahead and do that. We'll get out of the way, and he'll bring it. And
we're bipartisan.
Yeah. We all hate Steve King, although, she may say, look, there's more members on our side that want the guy expelled, but that's really not going to happen.
Get it. And for the purposes, let's start with censure. Censure doesn't mean you can't expel.
Right. Doesn't preclude it.
So, and Pelosi may say, well, and there's other people we'd like to do this as well, too, like Ted Cruz, but he's really not a member of this body. So why don't we start with Steve King and see where this goes?
Yeah. And
at least we all agree on Steve King.
Yeah, it'll be a little uncomfortable. There's a lot of people who now have to condemn him that are extraordinarily close to him.
I'm sorry I snuck Peter King's name in there. I really meant Steve. It really was an error.
Yeah, him too, though.
Him too.
Yeah, so you could see that happening on Monday afternoon or a Tuesday. But because it's likely, I think, to end up being brought by the Republican leader, they'll schedule it out, and I don't know whether they're going to get any prime time for it. They'll probably agree to do it sometime when hardly anybody's watching. It won't be middle of the night, but it'll be,
Yeah, but it'll be on C-SPAN 1.
Yeah. You'll be able to see it, and then they'll have their resolution. They'll debate it for an hour or so. I don't know. They'll use the whole hour because I don't think anybody's going to get up there and defend him. King probably won't speak. And if it passes, you are brought to the well of the House, and the
you are
resolution
berated.
of censure.
You are read a sternly worded letter, right? I mean, you have to sit there and take it.
Yeah. So, you'll get a chance to see that. That's nice. It won't change too much for Steve King, but he seems genuinely surprised that people are upset that he's a white supremacist, racist. I don't know why, but apparently this comes as a surprise to him that people would be upset by this.
Right. Again, one of the other stories, before we dig into a little bit more of the polling there, which we'll do after the break, is that Kremlin blessed Russia's NRA operation, U.S. Intel report says.
Yes, I did see
story
that.
out of the Daily Beast. So if you took NRA money, guys, you're in the barrel.
Yeah, and we know who took that, and there's some on the Democratic side, too, who will have to watch out for that. But, yeah, this connects to everybody, and that explains a lot of the reason why they might have been reluctant to do anything about Trump or believe it up to now.
Right. It's a spy story.
Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption, though it's still aimed at saying thank you to all of you who are supporters of the show. We've made a lot of progress. When we first started this campaign, fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners were donating to help keep us on the air, and now that's down to about 1 in 15, but we've got a long way to go. Remember, it won't take much. Our average monthly donation is currently about $7, for which you're getting 2 hours of great news and entertainment 5 days a week. What's that, 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. But as a wage, well, I think Democrats would be against that. But if we all put our 70 cents together, or even half of us, that'd really be something. And my kids could go to college. Now, that's not all on you. But remember, patreon.com, Patreon.com, is there to make it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X, or David Waldman, or Kagro in the Morning, or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box. And you'll be right there where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your continuing support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Everything running smoothly here as we have Mick Mulvaney in charge. I hope he doesn't F everything up like he did with everything else.
My friend Molly Youngfast noted that, Trump berated Mick Mulvaney in front of both parties publicly. Told him he really effed up everything, including the shutdown. And my friend Molly Youngfast tweeted, if you fire Mick Mulvaney, it's like firing 5 people.
It's true. Well, I mean, the unemployment rate skyrocketed today.
He gets to collect 5 times.
I think he could have used my joke. Like, I can't believe you screwed this up, Mulvaney. You only had 11 jobs. I mean, come on.
Exactly. Come on. So going back to what we were talking about just as the break came, Kremlin blessed Russia's NRA operation, U.S. Intel report says.
Bless you.
When Maria Butina and Alexander Torshin brought NRA bigwigs to Moscow, it wasn't a rogue mission. It was okayed from the very top, according to a report reviewed by The Beast, as they refer to themselves.
Wow, cute.
And just the pull quotes are great. My assessment of what was happening with Torshin and Butina and the NRA was that the Russians decided a good period of time before 2016 to run an influence operation here in the U.S.
Yes.
Right?
It seems that they did.
Yeah. International Affairs professor Nina Khrushchevska, you know who she is. She's the granddaughter of Khrushchev, of the New School, meanwhile, told the Daily Beast that the American intelligence officers who produced the report described in this piece may have overstated the Kremlin's organization and efficiency. just as we often do about the White House. I'm sure there's truth to the report, but the kind of incredible consistency and logic that Americans have in their report about what and how Russia's doing is just culturally wrong. Okay. It's a chaotic country that makes it up as it goes along.
Keep your shoe
but
on.
I don't think that that's going to be exculpatory, personally.
No, it describes.
But to be fair,
things perfectly, but it's just they're still doing this.
Yeah, it's like talking about Trump. Did they do this on purpose because this was his plan, or is it just total chaos? Well, it doesn't matter, really.
I don't know. He did it, so what do you want me to tell you? Okay. She's probably right about that, and good to keep in mind. They're not necessarily tightly coordinated masterminds all.
Right, at all times, under all things. All right, let's see. Here's Jeff Garin going back to the polling here. Compared to CNN's poll from a month ago, net disapproval for Trump among independents has risen from 7 to 18 points. Remember, you can't win national elections without independents. Everybody's going to go to their base. If you lose some of your base, you really get clobbered. But you lose the election when you lose the independents. Disapproval among Republicans has risen by 6 points, from 10% to 16%. And among non-college whites, again, Trump's net rating has gone from plus 15 to minus 2. Trump's law of holes seems to be that when you are in one, you keep digging, which is sometimes known as the law of a-holes.
Okay.
Well, he's got a point there.
I do not dispute it.
Right. Wow. Oh, Josh Chaffetz points out, and the Washington Post ABC poll finds net support for declaring an emergency at minus 35. That's not the temperature.
Wow.
That's the approve, disapprove.
Yeah. Well, even the emergency declaration doesn't even get good press from Republicans. So, okay.
But he's been working on it for a week. Right? He's been massaging stuff. He's been talking about it on Fox and Friends. He's trying to set the groundwork for an emergency declaration. Nobody wants it. The more he talks about it, the less people want it. That's
true. That's really interesting. And he's got no help in doing, although no help beyond the people in the White House who are the usual suspects. I mean, I guess the big difference here is there's just, I guess there's just too much of a body of Republican rhetoric against this sort of thing. Everybody's embarrassed by having it dragged out and saying, yeah, guys, the Freedom Caucus is for huge eminent domain grab.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, the whole thing is Trump has proven that you can, in fact, change the party, but it takes years. You can't do it in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
His hardcore base will go with him whatever he says, even if he changes his mind every hour. But the party as a whole needs to come along a little bit more slowly.
I guess so.
And they're not there, and they don't necessarily accept this. And, there are circumstances, this is showing, where Trump voters writ large, not the base, not the evangelicals, but the overall ones who gave him the small margin of victory in 2016, will break from him. Right. And perhaps already have.
Need more compromise.
If he does stuff like this.
I guess. Says we need naked pictures of everybody now.
Now, question on the table is, what do you do about it? Mike Domaski has an interesting article here where he's arguing for don't impeach him. Just beat the crap out of him in 2020.
Well.
And he says, look, there's a historical record that suggests that an electoral outcome will be much more widely accepted. Mr. Trump's partisans will whine about the unfairness of it all in either case. They'll blame voter fraud or George Soros or the fake news. But if voters have rebuffed the president, the whining will sound to most Americans like just that. There's one more reason I'd prefer to see Mr. Trump laid low via the ballot. It'll do more long-term damage to the Republican Party. If Mr. Trump is removed via impeachment and conviction, Republicans can say, see, we've come to our senses. We got that out of our system. But if they renominate Mr. Trump and stick with him through 2020 and the voters clearly say no, not again, Republicans are left sitting in the wreckage. They'll be trying to air out the Trump stench for a generation, maybe two, which is precisely the fate they deserve. And, of course, that's happened. It happened with Nixon. It happened with Herbert Hoover. And it's going to happen with Trump. But the thing is, I would argue to Mr. Tomasky that it's going to happen regardless. So why not just get rid of him and give them the stench?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what historical precedent he's really thinking of here. A lot of come close precedents.
Well, it's Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and the healing thing and all that sort of stuff. I mean, when you have somebody who's really bad and then you convince them to step down as opposed to actually impeaching them and then you get to decide it in the next election, it's a pure situation. The problem is you got to live with the consequences from now until when that happens. If there's a faster way of getting rid of a Russian asset in the White House, for example, then maybe you should take it.
Yeah, and of course the situation isn't exactly analogous. It would be if you want to look at it as purely political. But yeah, I mean, as horrible as Nixon was, there wasn't anybody who thought that he was acting on behalf of another country.
He wasn't, and so as bad as Nixon was, this is worse.
I mean, he had a terrible idea of what America should be.
Internalize that. And that's why I find it so funny with all of this going on. Oh, but let's set that aside for a moment. Let's just see how Kamala Harris would do against Donald Trump in 2020, as if none of this is true.
I guess. Yeah. So, okay.
It's just so weird when you hear that sort of stuff. Like, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
Well, I can't wrap my mind about what it would mean. And what if he gets impeached? So I got to go with what if nothing changes and the election were tomorrow? It's the only proper way to approach this.
I guess that's all the options that they've got. It's a weird way of doing anything.
Too complicated to do it otherwise.
I guess that's the only explanation for it. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, the one part of it that I did finally understand what point he was making was saying, all right, well, if you impeach him and it requires getting Republican agreement to remove him from office, I guess, the idea of saying, well, we've come to our senses and we'll pick a reasonable person next time. No, there's really never going to be any comparison to Trump. It doesn't matter who they nominate. They'll say, we've come to our senses. It's not Trump.
Yeah. So Peter Baker in the New York Times writes, Trump confronts the prospect of a nonstop political war for survival, which I think is more realistic and to the point, as opposed to let's pretend none of this happens and game out 2020. So it has come to this, Baker writes. The president of the United States was asked over the weekend, this was, yes, I think, by Gene Pirro, of all people, whether he was a Russian agent. And he refused to directly answer. By the way, another story says now his allies are upset that he didn't just take it head on and say no. Well, maybe he couldn't say no.
Sure he could. I'm baffled by this only because I said, had he said no, what difference would that make to anybody?
Right. Well,
of course he said no.
It's stupid stuff rather than dealing with the substance. The question, Baker writes, which came from a friendly interviewer, not one of the fake media journalists he disparages, was the most insulting thing I've ever been asked, he declared. But it's a question that has hung over his presidency now for 2 years. If the now 23-day government shutdown standoff between Trump and Congress has seemed ugly, it may eventually seem tame by comparison with what is to come. The border wall fight is just a preliminary skirmish in this new era of divided government. The real battle has yet to begin. Okay. So that's nice to look forward to. Of course, my answer is obviously puff pieces on how overqualified Ivanka is and how she should run the World Bank.
I did find that's another thing that happened Friday afternoon that was astonishing, is that there's not a bank in the world that will lend to them, but you might as well let them run the World Bank. All right.
That way they'll all lend to him. Don't you get it? Yeah. It's just perfect. That's exactly the way they operate.
Right. 5 hours later, the World Bank is empty. Weird. I don't know what happened. I don't know if they have money. They don't. But I can't imagine putting them in what the least likely people to be put in charge of a bank. And what bank? The World Bank. We'll just take a couple billion. Of course. Don't worry about it.
Trump. Here's an article from Politico. Says Trump and the GOP taking messaging hit on shutdown. New polls indicate the American public is putting the brunt of the blame on Republicans. And Dave Jameson tweets this and says, another way to put this, most Americans seem to understand what's going on here.
Yeah, it's not that hard.
That's why your messaging doesn't work. When the substance isn't there, you can't just fake it with messaging.
One of the consequences of the weather in the area, of course, a lot of this snow fell in the Washington, D.C. area. And normally what happens, I guess at first people's thought was, well, that's okay. I'm furloughed. I don't have to travel through the snow anyway. But, of course, as it turns out, we've missed this story, but some parts of the government are open, not just essential employees who have to work without getting paid, but some of the departments were, in fact, funded, and people who work there are getting paid. But normally, if a snowstorm like this, you would have to turn to the Office of Personnel Management. They're the ones who do the grown-up version of schools closed. Is your department opening today? Do you need to report to work, and on what basis? So all federal employees in a snowstorm would then turn to the OPM webpage or whatever or a call-in number for their department to ask, what do I have to do today? Except, guess who's furloughed? It's the people at the OPM, the people who are supposed to tell the people who are actually back at work whether or not they needed to come in today are not there. So total chaos in Washington, D.C. today. Pretty amazing.
Oh, it is pretty amazing. So you are snowed out? I mean, is school closed and all that sort of stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And for how long? Couple of weeks?
Well, yeah.
21 days?
You know how these things go. January is, we usually don't make it back from the holiday break. It usually snows around then and then closes school for an extra couple of days and stays really frigid. But it's good. Our big problem is refreezing. So the things are looking up today. They probably they should be back in tomorrow. I don't think the forecast is that bad for delay tomorrow. All right. So yeah, that's the most likely, which will, of course.
Your producer is really helpful. Really Tell him thank you.
Yes, I'll have to tell. All right. Well, I get all the news this way because everything's closed. I have lots of production help on days when things are closed, or various other mishaps befall us.
Right. Anyway, so going back to the very, very beginning of your show, I just want to say I'm more than happy to come and help you organize the news because, after all, that's what friends are for. They help you organize.
Why, thanks.
And I'm done. So
okay.
The rest of the show is up to you.
That's it.
It's your mess. You clean it up. So thanks so much for having me on. Today's Monday, and I'm speaking with my good friend David Waldman, Kagro in the Morning. We're just trading some tips on how to clean up the KITM hashtag. And, oh, by the way, we also talked a little politics. He'll do the rest of the show. I'll be back on Wednesday, hopefully with Joe McCarter. And if we're lucky, Kagro in the Morning will remain open without a shutdown. And we'll see you then. So thanks so much for listening, folks. And have a great day.
All right. Thanks, Greg. I think everything's going to work out. And I think the muting helped a little bit. I can mute messages with the singer's name in them. That helps.
Yeah, exactly. So that'll cut it in half at least to make it a little easier to read.
Right. I feel
without
bad.
Insulting anybody.
People might want an update on how the song's doing, whatever. But
well, it's fine. They can read it, but you don't have to read it.
Okay. Well, that's true. I might anyway, though.
Yeah, you never know.
Nothing else.
It might be a good song.
Right.
You should do your own song.
That's a thought. And then everybody would be clogging up her hashtag with my discussion.
Right. With the KITM jingle.
Yeah.
I think it's perfect.
I'll give it a try.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thank you. You do the same. Let's see. Where am I with the news here? Oh, I have Jack Ox is telling me there was no link to the podcast put up today. Did we forget to put it up? And that's a good question. I don't think so. I think I posted it and queued it, but it may be that things in the morning queue over at Daily Kos may have been a little haywire too, because the president's a Russian spy and stuff. So we might have been paying attention to a couple of other things. I don't know how that went. So I apologize for not getting that posted correctly. Sometimes when the schedule gets screwed up like this, things fall by the wayside. It is also the last minute scramble to finish up our oldest son's college applications. Plus, it's the end of the marking period is coming up. Lots of papers due. So we're running all over the place trying to help him keep up with his work. And when school's canceled the next day, you just start thinking about things differently, and things begin to fall apart. All right, let's see. Any other items that, other than the president being a Russian spy, that we need to get into? I mean, I really do kind of want to read through one or two of those pieces just to get the sense of how amazing the story is. But there are a few other things we'll catch up with. Speaking of Trump blaming other people for screwing up everything, this one's not about Mick Mulvaney. It's about everyone else. But that's the headline in the Washington Post. They screwed this whole thing up inside the attempt to derail Trump's erratic Syria withdrawal. And that's an unusual looking piece here too. By the way, illustrated with a photo of traveling Trump, that is khaki and rain slicker clad and baseball hat clad Donald Trump on his way to Marine One to fly down for his Texas visit. I believe that was on January 10th. That's the picture here. I only bring that up because, again, as we hinted at earlier in the show, one of the other things that Trump told Jeanine Pirro, over the weekend, I think it was with her that he was having this conversation. Apparently, he's perturbed at not getting more credit for having stayed in Washington during the shutdown. He thinks this is a major sacrifice for him, and it really is, because he likes to go to Mar-a-Lago during the holidays and really every other chance he gets. Ordinarily, he would be golfing the whole time, and somebody convinced him that it looks, leaderly and presidential for him to stick around the White House instead of taking off and going golfing, and I agree that's the better option. But he's furious that people don't give him more credit for it, even though that's the basic minimum that anybody should be able to expect from the president. So by way of expressing that frustration, he told Pirro, "I haven't left the White House in months," which, of course, I don't know if I want to take it too literally as a statement. Like, does going outside to the Rose Garden for a statement count as leaving the White House? No, not really. Should it count as leaving the White House that, for instance, he ran out to Camp David last weekend? Well, it was a working visit, and it was only a couple of hours. It's not like he stayed over there. And Camp David, it's not the White House, but it's an official presidential compound, and he doesn't know the difference. He's indoors, and if it's not Mar-a-Lago, it might as well be the White House. But he also had made, of course, everybody pointed it out, he had gone to Texas. That was the trip he's taking here in this picture on the 10th, on his way to the helicopter for the quick run to Texas. It's not like he's been out of the White House for extended periods of time, but there was, let's say, the Camp David thing, there was the Texas visit, and there was the Iraq visit, which lasted a little bit longer. But he didn't want to do any of those three things, and nothing happened during any of those three things. So I guess he appears to have no memory of it, or doesn't count them as having left the White House. One of the certainly the most minor of the idiotic things that happened over the weekend. This one that we started with is clearly much more important, though it's not necessarily the top of the list either. They screwed this whole thing up inside the attempt to derail Trump's erratic Syria withdrawal. Ann Gearan, Josh Dawsey, John Hudson for the Washington Post. Right. President Trump dispatched National Security Advisor John Bolton, that's a real thing, by the way, on a cleanup mission a week ago. He's been out of the White House. With a 3-day itinerary in Israel that was intended to reassure a close ally, and I guess that's supposed to be Israel, but there are others out there, that Trump's impulsive decision to immediately withdraw troops from Syria would be carried out more slowly and with important caveats, the way, things are normally done. The plan, and imagine having to send John Bolton to normalize things. The plan seemed to work at first, because after all, John Bolton was sent to speak to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who accepts that John Bolton is a wise old man who knows what he's doing. But Netanyahu, they report, was all smiles, thanking Bolton profusely for the show of U.S. support. But by the end of the week, attempts to dissuade Trump or place conditions on the withdrawal faded as the U.S. military announced it had begun the process of our deliberate withdrawal from Syria. A multi-pronged effort by alarmed U.S. national security officials, foreign allies, and Republican hawks in Congress to significantly alter or reverse Trump's decision was effectively a bust. Since Trump's abrupt Syria announcement last month, a tug of war with allies and his advisors has roiled the national security apparatus over how, whether to execute a pullout. And now they're all reading, oh my God, he's a Russian agent. That explains it. Netanyahu spoke to Trump 2 days before the president's announcement, and again a day afterward. French President Emmanuel Macron tried to get the president to change his mind. That was obviously a bust. That wasn't going to happen. Even Turkish President Erdogan, who liked the policy, was concerned it could not be safely executed so quickly. The episode illustrates the far-reaching consequences of Trump's proclivity to make rash decisions with uneven follow-through. That's a bad proclivity to have when you're a president. According to accounts of the discussions from more than a dozen current and former U.S. officials and international diplomats. Of course, they spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss the matters frankly. The president's erratic behavior on Syria cost him the most respected member of his cabinet, the only grown-up, remember that guy? Former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, rattled allies and partners unsure about U.S. commitment to the region, and increased the possibility of a military confrontation between Turkey and Kurdish forces in Syria. Just for starters. Starting the long overdue pullout from Syria while hitting the little remaining ISIS territorial caliphate hard and from many directions, Trump tweeted Sunday in another confusing message, very strongly tweeted that. Will devastate Turkey economically if they hit Kurds, Trump wrote. No one knows what it means. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sought to reassure allies in a lengthy tour of Arab capitals last week, promising that the U.S. withdrawal will not alter the Trump administration's commitment to fully defeat the Islamic State and drive Iranian forces out of Syria. Expelling, quote, every Iranian boot on the ground is an ambitious directive, but it's ours, it's our mission, Pompeo told reporters during a stop in the UAE on Saturday. The fact that a couple thousand uniformed personnel in Syria will be withdrawing is a tactical change. It doesn't materially alter our capacity to perform military actions we need to perform. The message did little to reassure jittery allies, or anyone else for that matter. One person familiar with the internal Syria debate said those in the president's inner sanctum are to blame for this mess, and that's always the case. They don't give him the kinds of options that he wants, and then he lashes out, this person said. It's not like it came out of thin air that he wanted to leave Syria. He campaigned on that. You can say it's a bad decision. You can say it's not helping stability, but you can't say you're surprised that he wanted to do it. Netanyahu was the second foreign leader to learn of Trump's decision last month, the first being Erdogan, to whom Trump had blurted out his sudden declaration of withdrawal in a December 14th phone call. The two rival U.S. allies have since played central roles in the Syrian drama. Trump's first call with the Israeli leader was on December 17th, arranged after a weekend of effort by Bolton, Mattis, and others to steer Trump from an abrupt decision. Current and former officials familiar with the events said some U.S. national security aides hoped that Netanyahu could help persuade Trump to slow the withdrawal, even if he went ahead with a planned announcement that week. Netanyahu expressed concern that Iran would be the unintended beneficiary of what Trump cast as an America First disentanglement from foreign wars. People familiar with the conversation said, speaking diplomatically, "Oh, you're great, Mr. Trump, you're wonderful." He told Trump that Israel would, quote, defend ourselves by ourselves, but would prefer more time to adjust, according to people familiar with the conversation. Trump announced a 30-day withdrawal 2 days later. Netanyahu and Trump spoke again as bipartisan and international criticism mounted on December 20th, the day Mattis resigned over what he considered a hasty abandonment of the Kurdish fighting force. This is, of course, an American decision, Netanyahu said at the time. We will study its timetable, how it will be implemented. No one knows. And, of course, its implications for us. In any case, we will take care to maintain the security of Israel. That's good. That's your job. And to defend ourselves in this area. We don't know how well they'll do it, but okay. Netanyahu renewed his concerns in a talk with Pompeo when they were both in Brazil this month. Wow. They're all over the place. Israel, meanwhile, appeared to increase its secretive campaign of airstrikes in Syria, including attacks near the capital, Damascus, on Christmas Day. How nice. Didn't bother them, though. Israel took the unusual step of acknowledging another round of strikes this weekend. Trump was stung by Mattis's resignation, it says here anyway, which the president saw as an inappropriate public rebuke. People familiar with his views said he was also angry about media coverage of his decision, including fact checks refuting his claim that the Islamic State had been defeated. But in the weeks to follow, he was also waging a battle with Democrats over a partial government shutdown. And as he was doing that, there were signs that Trump might be moderating his Syria position. Really? Trump seemed less bothered by what he viewed as the reflexive caution and slow walking of his directives by aides. More than half a dozen U.S. officials and international diplomats familiar with the debate said. The Pentagon suggested a departure timetable of 4 months rather than 1, and Trump has distanced himself from his stated policy while denying there was a shift. Well, he's great at that. All right. It's actually a rather lengthy article and worthy of combing through, but I think we've got the gist of what we needed out of that. It's chaotic in this, and nobody is sure who will be running policy at any given time on that front. I guess the another thing I guess we would throw out there is the companion piece, although we're bumping up against our next break. But that's okay. I'll need the break to scroll back and find it. I think we made mention of this perhaps last week or even the week before, but apparently there was a situation in which, well, he followed up the the Syria withdrawal with an equally out of the blue, equally rash declaration that we would be scaling back tremendously in Afghanistan as well. And here's the story I was looking for, and it's also from the Beast, the Daily Beast, inside the failed mission to get Trump to care about Afghanistan. I think one of those articles I may have mentioned for people to read either on their own or whatever, perhaps during a weekend break. But we might revisit that one after this break. The upshot, although we could skip it entirely if I say, long story short, the generals in Afghanistan apparently became quite nervous about this downsizing of their forces and felt that they had not been considered at all. Their input wasn't taken in any of this, and they wanted to have something to say. But the president wasn't open to hearing from them. They actually embarked on a campaign to get themselves on Fox News channel so that he might actually hear something from his own generals in Afghanistan and thereby afford them the input they thought they needed. We'll see if it worked. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We'll continue at least briefly with that piece, although I do have a bit of breaking news just to bring things up to date here. Breaking news, according to Breaking News, which is, what is that? I've run into that a couple of times. It's, I guess, a website that's actually called Breaking News, and it makes me worry about whether or not it's really true news. But it does, well, it points to an article in The Hill, which I quote all the time, so we'll take a look at that one. And I don't know that they're the best news source, but I do use them often enough. The Supreme Court apparently refusing to take up the case of whether or not Matthew Whitaker has been properly and legally appointed as acting Attorney General, which is a surprising well, I mean, I guess it's not surprising that they let more confusion reign, but I wish they had taken this one on. I'd be curious to find out what the reasoning is. It may, in fact, be solid on procedural grounds in the end, or it may just be a partisan decision. We'll find out. But the news quickly is here, according to The Hill, the Supreme Court on Monday refused to hear a challenge to the legality of President Trump's decision to name Matthew Whitaker acting Attorney General. So we'll see which case this is, too. The request came in a case which the court also refused to review, disputing the constitutionality of the lifetime ban on felons owning guns when it's applied to someone who served their sentence a long time ago and has since been a law-abiding citizen. So I'm not even familiar with that case, but it sounds like that must be one of the several cases in which you're essentially suing the Justice Department for whatever reason, and you basically need to know whose name you're supposed to be putting on the complaint as the current head of that department. And should I be putting Matthew Whitaker? Should I stick with Jeff Sessions until there's a new person appointed? Shouldn't it really be Rod Rosenstein? So they've rejected that approach anyway. Although, I guess from this, it's still not entirely clear whether they reject all such approaches or they're just saying, well, we're not going to take up that question because we're rejecting the underlying case as well. We'd be willing to take up the question of whose name should be on the cover page of the lawsuit, but only if we're going to also take the underlying substantive case, and then we'll settle the question then. So it's not entirely clear that that avenue is closed off, or that this is any indication that the court considers the appointment valid and legal for all intents and purposes going forward. So, all right, interesting. Let's see. Before we get back over to the article we were reading, I guess I'll take another moment's pause to note something that Armando sent me by way of an update on the Steve King situation. He sent me Philip Rucker's tweet that reads, President Trump, who follows the news more closely than most Americans, or at least some version of the news, I guess we could say, told reporters this morning he was not familiar with Representative Steve King's white supremacist comments. And I think I might even believe that because they've been more or less avoiding the subject on the kinds of shows that Trump turns to for what he calls news. It's entirely possible, although really if you have even a passing familiarity with who's in Congress, and he's been there a while, you would have heard dozens of such comments. But Trump really is more or less oblivious to everything in Congress, doesn't know the people in it, doesn't know the names of the people that he deals with all the time who are in it. So it's actually entirely possible, but it's just all it means is he's a very, very dumb guy. All right. Anyway, let's see. How long is this piece? Can we get through this? I think so. This Afghanistan piece. It really is now a more important part of the puzzle now that we realize how badly they seem to have screwed up in Syria as well. Inside the failed mission to get Trump to care about Afghanistan, the president seems totally committed to a drawdown and morale on the ground is exceedingly low, says Aaron Banco for the Daily Beast. In the months leading up to General John W. Nicholson's departure from Afghanistan in September, his top advisors and staffers set out on an unusual mission. Oh, this is even before the announcement of the drawdown. One that took place not in the foothills of the Hindu Kush, but inside a compound in Kabul. Their goal, find a way to convince President Donald Trump and members of Congress to support troops staying behind on the ground in the 17-year-long war, according to 3 individuals involved in the discussions. It was the summer of 2018. Public support for U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan had waned, and the president was again threatening to pull the plug on the U.S. mission. Nicholson and his team feared the American public, too, no longer understood why troops needed to stay. I think that's a fair assessment. The goal, one of Nicholson's top staffers said, was to get people to care again, and to do so they sought to better publicize how the U.S. was increasingly involved in monitoring the growing peace protests across the country and hoped to capitalize off the movement to broker talks between the Taliban and the government. There was a massive push to get people to understand that there was still work to do, peace talks to finish, the source said. Nearly 3 months after Nicholson's departure, however, it seems that his mission has at least partially failed. General Austin S. Miller was installed in place of Nicholson, and Zalmay Khalilzad was appointed U.S. Special Advisor for the country and is currently leading the peace talks. But President Trump is nevertheless preparing to pull half of U.S. troops, some 7,000 in total, out of Afghanistan. And any hope of Nicholson's mission succeeding has quickly faded. On the ground, senior advisors and staffers who have been briefed on the president's decision told the Daily Beast morale is at an all-time low. We know now that the withdrawal is going to happen, one senior advisor said. Now it's just a matter of time until it happens. We had hoped that we could pull this off. The growing discontent among troops and what they view as the president's general lack of regard for their effort reflects a larger disconnect between the administration's top military officials and their commander-in-chief. For more than a year, sources say, U.S. leadership in Kabul and elsewhere in the country have tried to increasingly find ways to garner the attention of and curry favor with Trump. Bribes work, by the way, guys. But that task has proved difficult because they don't have that much money, even though the president thinks they make $1 million apiece, apparently. The task has proved difficult as the president's focus often drifted to internal Washington politics. The president has yet to visit Afghanistan and did not meet with Nicholson before he left his post. Efforts to put off a hasty withdrawal have been taking place for years, but they culminated during the weeks prior to this summer's NATO summit, when Nicholson's advisors met in Afghanistan to discuss broad-stroke strategy decisions, including publishing more video content about military activities on social media and pushing out information about the growing peace protests. I guess that's on everybody's mind here. Well, why don't we... The military says, how do we get more attention? Pivot to video. By the way, that's actually an extraordinarily controversial thing in the last couple of months or so, I guess I would say. I've seen and even put aside occasional articles for sharing that we've just never gotten to. The news cycle is just too crazy. About, I guess if you're involved in the media professionally at all, you would have seen this thing. But apparently some second thoughts, let's say, about the pivot to video thing. But apparently all sorts of social media metrics and data that was behind the drive to this thing that gets, I guess it comes under the shorthand of pivot to video, drove lots of professional newsrooms around the country and the corporate boardrooms that control those newsrooms to make staffing decisions and funding decisions that ended up, costing a lot of traditional reporters their jobs, with the idea that they would be replaced with more social media oriented staffs producing more video content, because all indications were, all the metrics said that was the stuff that drove engagement and drove eyeballs. And I guess the idea being driving people to generate the traffic that would by itself then be traded to generate ad revenue, even though that model is falling apart too. And then it turned out that most of the data behind it, if I understand things correctly, most of the data behind it turned out to be garbage and mostly made up by the social media companies who stood to benefit from the ad revenue. And so entire business models of huge swaths of the American media were reshaped based on garbage models, and there's not much chance of being able to reconstruct that infrastructure, nor an agreement across the board in those boardrooms that is something that needs to be done. Although there was never agreement that it ever needed to be done, but we're not sure how much impact the revelation that the data was bogus or horribly skewed at a minimum ever reached them. Anyway, just very interesting that apparently these decisions to fake the data have tremendous consequences well beyond what they might have thought of. It could be destroying the ability of the American military to communicate their mission as well as they pivot to video. So here we are. Efforts to put off that hasty withdrawal have been taking place for years, but they culminated during the weeks prior to the NATO summit, when Nicholson's advisors met in Afghanistan to discuss broad-stroke strategy decisions, including publishing more video content about military activities on social media and pushing out information about the growing peace protests. One of these strategy sessions focused on getting the president's attention, a very focused targeting there, by asking Fox News correspondents to embed with the troops. Now, that's something they ordinarily are anxious to do, right? The network ultimately did not send a correspondent, two sources familiar with the plan said. Senior military advisors in Afghanistan told the Daily Beast that former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis supported the idea of pushing out more content about activities on the ground, and he understood the plan that Khalilzad had set forward to broker negotiations between the Taliban and President Ashraf Ghani, a viewpoint shared by Nicholson. It is time for this war in Afghanistan to end, Nicholson said in his farewell speech in September, later talking directly to the Taliban. Whose voices are important, he asked, the outsiders who are encouraging you to fight, or the voices of your own people who are encouraging you to peace? Mattis resigned from his post December 20th, in part over his opposition to Trump's policy of drawing down troops in Syria and Afghanistan. His departure has senior advisors on the ground in Afghanistan worried there is essentially no top official in the administration who understands their mission and the importance of staying put. Patrick Shanahan, a former Boeing executive, has assumed the title of acting Secretary of Defense but has little experience in military operations. Maybe this wouldn't have happened under a different president, one source said, but we get what we get. Oh boy. In a cabinet meeting this Wednesday, and I guess the military has to say that, right? Trump was adamant about his decision to withdraw troops from the country. I gave our generals all the money they wanted. They didn't do such a great job in Afghanistan, Trump said. So simplistic. Later adding that he essentially fired Mattis, in his view, for his lack of progress on the ground. It's unclear when or how troops will begin to withdraw from the country. The president has yet to formally announce the official drawback, and the Pentagon said it's not ready to announce changes in troop deployments. Peace talks with the Taliban continue. We are considering all options of force numbers and disposition, said Lieutenant Colonel Kone. I hope I've got his name right. Kone. It's not apostrophe, but accented. Kone Faulkner, a spokesperson for the Pentagon. Not as much emphasis in the article as there was during the tweeting around of this article on the idea of getting the message on Fox News so that the president would be able to see it. But that was, at the time, people were discussing it. That was the hot news bite from that article. It didn't come through, really, I don't think, in the text of the article the same way. So sensationalist headlines have drawn us in once again. All right, well, certainly worth sharing at any rate. We scrolled a ways back in order to get that. What was the date on that article? The 4th, January 4th. I'm asking because it happens to be next to another article of intriguing headline, and I wonder whether we should bother opening it up or whether it is dated at this point. What is the point of Sarah Sanders? It sounds like a good question, though it's a January 7th piece. I don't remember what that one was about, but it does sound rather intriguing, doesn't it? I mean, I guess beyond, I assume that the question is, what's the point of listening to somebody who so habitually and so easily lies on behalf of the administration and whose statements are constantly contradicted by actual reporting, often by the very people that she's briefing right there in that briefing room each day? I don't know. I don't know if I want to know what the point of Sarah Sanders is, so we might move on from there. Let's see. Another yet unresolved question about the shutdown that it remains unresolved because the president has said one thing, or maybe both things, and others in the administration have given either a different interpretation or there's just been no official follow-up. There's no paperwork that proves that there's any substance behind the president's off-the-cuff tweets or remarks. But at some point early last week, the story was that the White House was announcing that that they would be requiring the IRS to be ready to process and issue tax refunds during the shutdown, because initial reports were that, the agency does remain unfunded, and that that being the case, their work of sending out people's income tax refunds was likely to be deferred or delayed otherwise during the shutdown, and that was the sort of real-world money consequence that even Donald Trump was willing to take notice of. So an announcement went out that the Internal Revenue Service will make tax refunds, even if the government remains shut down when they are set to be issued. The Trump administration said on Monday. That was reported on the 7th in The Hill by Jordan Fabian. Tax refunds will go out. Russell Vought, Vought, the acting director, of the White House Office of Management and Budget, told reporters during a briefing. Vought, and I don't think it's Vought, but Vought, I'm guessing, said the move was a change from past shutdowns and that the appropriate agencies would issue further guidance. In other words, it's a change from past shutdowns. So what it means is normally, no, you don't issue those refunds. That's one of the pressure points that is supposed to move the parties back to trying to find a solution and reopen the government. Yes, it will cause major pain and disruption if the refunds don't go out, and that's supposed to motivate you to fix these things. Of course, refunds usually go out when do we see those things? I guess in the spring, and I don't know what percentage of taxpayers actually file at the April 15th deadline, but I suppose you won't be getting your refund until later if you don't file until then. But the early filers, I guess, would begin to see refunds perhaps a little earlier. Isn't that the way it goes? I'm not an accountant. I'm not close enough to that to know exactly when they get mailed. But I only bring that up because government shutdowns, I mean, it says, okay, it's different from previous shutdowns. There can't be that many government shutdowns at the appropriate time because April is about the time when you would normally be submitting the first go-rounds of the next year's budgets and appropriations bills. You'd be well into the next fiscal year's budgeting cycle in April or May, or really even in March. That stuff has already begun, and government shutdowns tend to occur initially, of course, around the end of the fiscal year. September changing over into October. We sometimes kick the can down the road a little bit with continuing resolutions, but the bulk of government shutdowns are late fall to early winter, with occasional problems running into December when continuing resolutions run out. But they usually then fix those with 2-month continuing resolutions that allow everybody to take a holiday break and come back in January and work things out by early February when that CR would ordinarily run. It's very rare to see a government shutdown in the April-May time period. And so, or even earlier, if people begin filing their taxes immediately, say at the close of the year, if they happen to have all the relevant paperwork. But most people have to wait until February at the minimum anyhow. So anyway, the real point of bringing this up is Vought said the move was a change from past shutdowns and the appropriate agencies would issue further guidance. I haven't seen it, but I haven't been on the lookout for it. But I'm more concerned about whether this is just another one of those things that the press heard from the White House, a perfectly normal thing. That no, we're not going. We're going to do everything we can to prevent further disruption. And the president can order this, and he's doing so, and we'll take care of it. And then it turns out nobody in the White House has any idea how to formally make such a thing happen, and nobody ever issues any of the paperwork that has to go along with it in order to, put substance behind the pronouncement. And it's not clear that they know that they're supposed to, and it's not clear that they would know how, even if they did know they were supposed to. House Democrats, the article continues, are planning to pass legislation this week, that would have been last week, to fund the Treasury Department and IRS as part of their effort to push Republicans to end the shutdown, but the measure is not expected to become law. Issuing the tax refunds might lower pressure on Trump and his GOP allies in Congress to abandon their demand for $5.7 billion in border wall funding and reopen the government. Refunds have been frozen or delayed during past government shutdowns. It has happened. We have been trying to make this as painless as possible, consistent with the law, said Vogt, but it remains unclear whether the administration has the legal authority to hand out refunds during the partial shutdown, which is now in its third week, and of course now in its fourth. The Treasury Department, which oversees the IRS, is one of the agencies that had its funding lapse, and processing refunds could require furloughed employees to be put back to work. Unpaid, of course. The IRS announced in Monday evening guidance, so they actually did put some out, that tax filing season will begin on January 28th. We are committed to ensuring that taxpayers receive their refunds notwithstanding the government shutdown. That's a nice commitment, but I don't know if they can do it. I appreciate the hard work of the employees and their commitment to the taxpayers during this period, IRS Commissioner Chuck Rettig said in a release. I am not 100% sure how well that will go, by the way, because, of course, remember what you're asking people to do. Come back to work unpaid in order to handle the job of passing out government money to everyone else. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get that done, especially as more and more federal employees are feeling the pinch of not having been paid and are leaving the federal workforce, sometimes without telling anybody, that either temporarily or possibly permanently, if they find a steady source of income elsewhere. But people are having to, drive for Uber during the furlough, although they don't know who to drive because nobody's got any cash because they haven't been paid. Anyway, and there's a lot less business being conducted in the area, so a lot less call for Uber, really. But so they come up with other solutions and they do other things, perhaps. But a lot of the jobs that you might ordinarily think to go to for quick temporary cash are themselves feeling the pinch of the shutdown, whether that's office cleaning or Uber driving or messenger services of some kind. A lot of the periphery is affected when federal workers aren't reporting on the job. Speaking of which, there was news report last night, I think, that the airport in Houston, which isn't that the George H.W. Bush airport now, but the airport in Houston apparently just had to close entirely one of its TSA screening stations in one of the terminals, the terminal A, B, and C. They closed the terminal B TSA screening station. And you'll still have to, even if your flights are going out of Terminal B, you still have to be screened. You just have to divert to one of the other terminals and go through security there and then somehow transfer to the terminal you want. I don't even know how they're working that logistically, but it's because people aren't showing up. They're not getting paid, and it's not that they're taking labor action and striking necessarily while they're not getting paid. They're just trying to find other sources of income, and I got to be somewhere else earning money. I can't be coming to work for free here at my TSA job. So let's see. Let's finish up this piece here. The IRS has been working under a non-filing season shutdown contingency plan since the funding lapse started in late December. A Treasury spokesman said Monday that the IRS will finalize and release its filing season lapse plan in the coming days. They have different plans depending on when in the year they shut down. House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Richard Neal, a Democrat of Massachusetts, said in a statement that he spoke on the phone with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin from, I'm sure, some exclusive resort somewhere, and IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig on Monday, and that would be last Monday, looks forward to seeing more detailed description of how the agency will carry out these operations, particularly what will be expected of Treasury and IRS personnel. Neal also said that he hopes the Senate will act on a bill that the House has, or that was expected to pass last week, to fund the IRS. And that did, of course, I'm sure, pass the House. It just doesn't matter because the Senate opts so far not even to take it up. So, well, we'll see how this plays out. But, no indication yet. All it is more statements of the expectation that somebody somewhere will file paperwork that'll make it all official. It's not necessarily the case that I would have expected to see coverage of that paperwork being issued, but I have my doubts, and I really just wanted to reiterate to everybody that I think very frequently you will find that these positions are taken and announced by the White House only to find out that they were just not followed up on, either because no one knew they had to, or worse, no one knew how to do it even if they wanted to. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. A little trouble with the old mute button there. And keeping an eye on what's happening in the news, and B, what Armando is sending me here, and trying to decide which direction to go. Let's pick this up here. What Armando has sent me is a Greg Sargent tweet, right? In light of blockbuster revelations about Trump and Russia. Oh, really? Have there been any? It's time to intensify scrutiny of McConnell's role. Okay, I could see why we would want to build on this. Remember, of course, most of you will have no difficulty recalling all of this, that McConnell has refused to present a united front against Russian interference that back as far as 2016, scuttled efforts to protect Mueller, and won't hold any votes to reopen government. And he's got a new piece discussing that, along with a horrific close-up photo of Donald Trump illustrating the piece. And people have been making excellent points that I guess if you were Putin, let's say, and pulling the puppet strings on Trump, I guess shutting down the United States government, to the extent you could get that done, would be a bit of a dream come true. So I guess he's enjoying that. That brings me back to the original thought I had in the opening minutes of the show about the idea of the two translators being the only ones inside the room during their meeting in Helsinki. And I was thinking along the lines of, we discussed a few weeks back about what sorts of things could Trump be doing, or Putin be doing, if he really wanted to screw with everybody, including Trump, because I don't know how valuable. A big question mark in all of this is, how valuable is Trump to Putin? Is Putin convinced that he can actually affirmatively drive United States policy through Trump by saying you should do this and Trump will go do that? Or does he really think the extent of his power is, well, I can use my control over Trump to undermine existing policy? I don't know if I could replace it with new affirmative policy through Trump or not, but a good bet, if Putin is smart, and who knows, I'm not certain how to judge his intelligence, really, at least in matters of how much he understands about American government. But if he's smart, I guess he wouldn't need to know that much about American government, other than, well, if I wanted to try to control Trump so that he would affirmatively place some sort of pro-Russian policy in place, he's terrible at doing things in general, and he's a very dumb guy, and the likelihood of successfully implementing policy for whatever reason and of whatever kind is severely diminished by the fact that he's an idiot and is surrounded by yet more idiots. We've had a lot of, arguably idiotic presidents. But the argument has always been, well, they'll be surrounded by competent people who will do a reasonably good job of making it look like the president knows what they're doing, even though we all know he doesn't. And this president hasn't even got that. So I wouldn't count on it if I were Putin. I might be just as happy just to screw up whatever it is the Americans want to do and be confident that they would continue to screw it up. But I guess I was wondering whether if he were to tire of that, or if he really wanted to demonstrate his control over Trump. I mean, one of the things that Trump really would abhor would be being humiliated in some fashion, but still having to be subservient to Putin. And I would wonder whether Putin would want to do something like that. So a couple of weeks ago, we speculated on the possibility of Putin just saying, if there were a deal to be made with Trump on a Moscow Trump Tower or some sort of Trump-branded property or merchandise to be sold here in Russia, that would be great. It would be very profitable for me. And I would like to talk Donald Trump into making such a deal. It would be very profitable for him as well. But I understand that would get him in a lot of trouble domestically, politically. Because, of course, he would, you'd have an emoluments question and a bribery question. And, everything having to do with Russia is so inflamed these days. And so I can't do that to him because it would cause him a lot of problems. And if I cause him problems, I won't be able to effectuate my own policy preferences in the United States. But if you don't think you're really capable of affecting your own policy preferences, just screwing up ones you don't like that Americans arrive at on their own, you might begin to think, well, what the hell? I did start out this discussion by saying it would be extraordinarily profitable to me. It would be all the more profitable to me if Donald Trump weren't able to stake a claim to a share of the profits, either because political pressure at home made it impossible for him to do, or if I just never offered him those windfalls, those profits in the first place. In other words, if I, as essentially an outlaw state, simply just said, well, I'm going to sell licenses in Russia to oligarchs to give them the right to sell Trump-branded properties or merchandise here in Russia. Ordinarily, as a private citizen, Donald Trump complains bitterly and seeks some sort of international court redress. And he might complain bitterly and might even seek that redress even as president of the United States, although that's a complicated matter to have to involve yourself in. But what does Putin care? I'm not going to obey any sort of international court order on these things, and we're already all under sanctions. There's nothing I have left to worry about, especially if sanctions aren't going to be lifted. I'll just generate money internally or take money from people countries who want to profit off of this, who haven't agreed to the regime of sanctions. And, what power has Donald Trump got short of going to war with Russia for his own personal financial benefit? What mechanism has he got to stop me from pocketing all this money? I should just be a gangster already and do it. Yeah, it's totally illegal, but I don't think Donald Trump has any options for stopping me. So I'm going to demonstrate how much more powerful I am than he is, and thereby further undermine the United States system of government and make a tremendous amount of money in the process. And, will oligarchs buy it if they know that they don't have any legal right to it? In our country, Vladimir Putin is the law. He's asking me to send him $1 billion in exchange for the right to print money here in Russia, because for some reason people will still buy Trump-branded stuff in Russia, although maybe they're beginning to doing it ironically now and not enthusiastically as they once did. But if you think you can make money on a Trump-branded project or product in Russia, I don't see why you wouldn't pay the bribe. And also, of course, even if you don't suspect, if you suspect that it will be a bust, but Vladimir Putin is strongly encouraging you to try anyway, you kind of got to pay the bribe. So I don't know whether he's really doing that or whether he's ever considered it, but I'd like to propose the idea to him, except I don't really want to enter into a formal business arrangement about it because he'll probably kill me afterwards. But that brings me to the next issue, which was if you really wanted to screw with Trump politically just for fun without necessarily getting rid of him, or you enjoyed putting him in the untenable positions that he's been in lately trying to defend himself from, you would be able to, you'd benefit doubly by, quite honestly, killing the translators, one or both of them, really, who were at the Helsinki meeting, because it would be awfully suspicious. Now, Trump has gone to great lengths, the other headlines of the weekend report, to conceal what went on there. And that's so unusual, et cetera, et cetera. And if the translator, who's the only other person who knew what went on there, but has been sworn to secrecy and had their notes confiscated, also turned up dead under suspicious circumstances, or otherwise, for that matter, who would you blame first? Would you think Trump killed that person, or would you think Putin must have done it? I'm not certain which conclusion I would draw, which is why I think that he should kill the translator and leave a Trump wig at the scene or something like that to try a completely obvious and totally transparent effort to frame Trump for it. But then people would say, he's that bad. He might have done this murder that badly, Donald Trump. It could really be him. I don't know. Just some weird speculation to come out of a weird weekend. Anyway, the article that Greg Sargent wrote and that Armando sent to me is now before us. My new piece here. Let's open it up. Not mine, Greg's. Trump is doing immense damage. He has a hidden helper. Let's find out who that hidden helper is. This picture of him is horrible, by the way. And he's only half painted in this photo. And his paint is fading and chipping off of his face, and he's becoming less orange every day. 2 new blockbuster scoops about President Trump's relations with Russia, combined with fresh signs that Trump will drag out the government shutdown indefinitely, should renew our focus on the quiet but critical role that Mitch McConnell has played in enabling the damage that Trump is doing to the country on so many fronts. As the shutdown drags on into its 4th week, causing cascading impacts around the country, the Post reports that pressure is now likely to intensify on the Senate Majority Leader to allow votes on measures reopening the government. 3 Senate Republicans have already called for a reopening, and as one GOP strategist put it, a few more coming out changes the calculus for McConnell. Meanwhile, thanks to new reporting over the weekend, the basic question of whether Trump has, at pivotal moments, acted in Russia's interests to the detriment of U.S. interests is being thrust to the forefront with new urgency. This should cause us to revisit the role that McConnell played during the campaign in preventing members of Congress from showing a united public front against Russian sabotage of the election. The New York Times reports that after Trump fired James B. Comey as FBI director, FBI officials began an investigation into whether Trump had been working for Russian interests. The concern was that, in obstructing the FBI's inquiry, Trump might have made it harder to determine what Russia had done during the election, thus helping Russia skirt accountability for an attack on American democracy. As the FBI general counsel put it at the time, or bluntly put it, a crucial theoretical question was whether the President of the United States fired Jim Comey at the behest of Russia, impairing an effort to determine the scope of a threat to national security. Well, I mean, he told Lester Holt that, he told him that it was relieving pressure on him. And he used the same formulation in speaking to the Russians in the Oval Office, but why he would tell the Russians when they visited the Oval Office anything about that at all, why that would even be an appropriate topic of conversation is what leads to the questions here. Meanwhile, The Post reports that Trump has gone to great lengths to conceal his private discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin from even his own advisors. The result, there is no detailed record, even in classified files, of Trump's face-to-face interactions with the Russian leader at 5 locations over the past 2 years. He's meeting his handler. One shadow narrative unfolding in the background over the past 2 years has been the gradual discovery of how broad the scope of Russian sabotage of the 2016 election really was. This has made certain events during the campaign appear more serious in retrospect. In September of 2016, as the Post has reported, top Obama administration officials privately asked senior congressional leaders in both parties to go public with a united front against Russian interference. But McConnell refused, claiming, in the Post's words, that he would consider any effort by the White House to challenge the Russians publicly an act of partisan politics. McConnell also questioned the intelligence demonstrating Russian sabotage. We've since learned a great deal about the Russian interference that McConnell raised doubts about. Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III's indictments of Russian nationals laid out a very detailed plot to corruptly swing the election. More recently, Senate Intelligence Committee reports demonstrated the extraordinary reach of the Russian disinformation campaign, which included elaborate efforts to divide the country on racial and cultural lines. Remember, it was widely known during the election that some sort of Russian interference efforts were taking place. Hillary Clinton was talking about it at every debate, right? Candidate Trump was downplaying the seriousness of these efforts or dismissing them altogether. It's hard to know how much of a difference it would have made if congressional leaders went public with bipartisan acknowledgement and condemnation of the Russian interference effort, but it certainly would have helped educate the public and shed light on just how indefensible Trump's downplaying of Russian sabotage really was. Of course, that might have hurt Trump's candidacy, so for McConnell, it was apparently a non-starter. Now we discover there is fresh reason to wonder just how deep Trump's loyalties to Putin and Russia ran throughout the whole period. What we still do not know is how detailed and convincing a briefing McConnell and his other officials received on what was happening. We should revisit this. What's more, we're also learning that in the view of intelligence officials, Trump's obstruction of justice efforts were potentially more damaging to the country than we thought. They concluded that by firing Comey, Trump was making it harder to learn the truth about Russian sabotage of our democracy, irrespective of whether there was any collusion. And lots of writing and analysis also over the weekend, toward the end of the weekend, noting, not only did he fire Comey, but he also fired or otherwise pushed out every top spy hunter, Russian spy hunter in the FBI and much of the intelligence community, one after another, whether they were high-profile people or people no one had ever heard of. And this was allowed to go on. This raises new questions about another McConnell action. The article continues, the refusal to hold votes on legislation protecting the special counsel. In fairness, Trump has still not moved successfully against Mueller, but McConnell scuttled efforts to protect Mueller even though Trump privately tried to fire him twice. There's still time for Trump to act, and passing such protections, which the Democratic House would support, would plainly make any such action and the damage it would cause less likely. There's also a forward-looking dimension here. As the Lawfare podcast notes, if FBI officials opened a separate investigation into whether Trump was obstructing the probe to help Russia, it's plausible McConnell and other congressional offices were briefed on this. That would make the failure to act to shield Mueller worse. We need to know more about this, too. On the shutdown front, McConnell continues to refuse votes on bills reopening the government that have already passed the House. McConnell claims there's no point because Trump wouldn't sign them. This actively shields Trump from having to veto bills funding the government, which would make it much harder for him to keep holding out. Worse, McConnell privately told Trump in December that he has no leverage and no endgame here, meaning McConnell knows full well that not forcing Trump's hand leaves us adrift with no exit in sight. Meanwhile, what happens if Trump declares a national emergency to build his wall, a nakedly autocratic act that will further damage our institutions? Under the National Emergencies Act, both chambers of Congress have the authority to reverse such a declaration. Will McConnell's Senate take such a step, or will he allow Trump to rampage forward on this too? In much discussion of all these matters, there is a terrible rhetorical habit of treating the GOP conduct toward Trump as mere passive acquiescence. In fact, this is better seen as active enabling on one front after another. And we are likely to learn much more about how damaging this has been soon enough. Armando, in sending this to me, questioned whether the House could investigate the conduct of a senator in all of this. And this is another one of these weird paradoxes. A paradox similar to the Mad King problem, the madness of King George issue of with the FBI investigation of the president. Is the president somebody that you actually can even theoretically investigate as a Russian asset, since the job is necessarily going to be one in which you're going to have a lot of contact, and confidential contact at that, with high-ranking Russian officials. And ordinarily, in the ordinary course of business, it's not an issue. And of course, everything is so, and I guess that's because everything, even if it's not all shared with the public, it's all documented in presidential records, which at least potentially do fill in the blanks of the record eventually, though not as necessarily within a time frame with which you can really do anything with it politically, but at least historically, we would eventually find out what happened. And presidents are conscious of that and conduct themselves accordingly. Whereas here, that's not entirely, might not be the case. That he may not be thinking about the future at all. And to the extent he thinks about it, he's probably thinking about it incorrectly anyway. And he's not ashamed of the dumb and corrupt things that he normally does. So he's not likely to be ashamed of these either. So this is a very different situation, but our laws and the assumptions we make about them are geared for a very different kind of situation. They're just not designed to deal with a shameless thief who acknowledges, almost acknowledges all the stealing he does as smart, and that who basically says, yeah, I ran for president in order to legalize a whole new realm of theft. How do you deal with that? Similarly, ordinarily, I would say, no, there would be fairly serious problems with the House spending its time investigating a senator, and it would be awfully difficult for them to justify if it weren't for the fact that, if you're a spy, if you're acting as an agent, or if you're involved in espionage, the fact that you're doing it from official cover should be expected, and probably as a matter of tradecraft is expected. And but you normally pursue this stuff from somewhere else, that it wouldn't be there wouldn't be a separation of powers. It's not really a separation of powers as between is not really the term you want to use, as between the two houses of Congress. But there are certainly there are norms that strongly discourage that sort of probing into the business of the other house. So it would be problematic, to be sure, and I don't know even what would happen with respect. How do you compel a senator's testimony before a House investigative committee? I don't think you could do it, and I don't know who would even be able to enforce it, and I don't know what happens as between the Sergeant at Arms of the House and the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. How do you decide on that one? That's one the courts are even less likely to be interested in settling. I think McConnell's just untouchable in the House. That would have to be an executive branch
investigation. I don't see how you could certainly develop a record. They couldn't, and by the same token, the Senate couldn't stop you directly from developing a record of McConnell's activities and your explanation of them. But how much investigation you could do, I guess it ends at subpoenaing anything from the other body. Anyway, and of course, they could indirectly bring pressure to bear to force you off of the investigation as well, i.e. refuse to pass anything that the House sends over. However, since we're likely to be looking at that anyway, I don't know that it puts you in any relative disadvantage. So I don't know if anything is really lost by conducting this investigation or developing the record anyway. Okay. Let's see. We're getting close up to the end of the show, and I thought that was some interesting speculation to spend some time on. That's what we'd like to do here. There's a couple other things that we'll need to get to, many of which will wait for Tuesday. Who knows how much of it will be preempted by craziness yet to come. But we'll see how that goes. I'm trying to anticipate other things or see whether there's anything else that we need to throw out and that we can actually fit in here. Yeah, let's do this one. And I'll just grab here from Josh Marshall, and dive right in without attempting to give my own explanation because we're short on time. We need to talk about the Bezos thing. Josh says so. I agree. And he did this mid last week, and things only got worse with Trump tweets over the weekend. He says, I don't know anything about Jeff Bezos. I don't know whether he and his wife were already getting a divorce and had begun dating other people, or whether the news about his relationship/affair triggered the divorce announcement yesterday. That was the middle of last week. We didn't note it at all. Because who cares, right? Well, now we have to care. He's no kid in a cage on the border, but I do not think we can ignore the fact that the story was broken by the National Enquirer, and that the Enquirer has served as a personal attack vehicle for the now president for a couple of decades. One of the guys who now has a cooperating agreement with New York prosecutors over the hush payoffs is one of the bylines on the Bezos story. That's Dylan Howard. Bezos, because he owns the Washington Post, is one of Trump's top enemies. He's repeatedly attacked him on Twitter, and he did so again over the weekend, and many more times in other settings. One would certainly think that the folks at the Enquirer would be cautious about doing Trump's bidding if they're in the middle of a major criminal probe, even if they've gotten immunity. That makes me question the theory to some degree. But I'm not sure it's really any reason to think they'd stop their usual practices. There's no campaign. Presumably there's no exchange of money. Can I prove that this was done at Trump's instigation or on Trump's behalf? No. I have nothing else beyond an obvious surmise, the most logical of inferences. But now it's certainly true that the Enquirer has a business of affair stories. Maybe this just dropped into their lap. But I think we should be very suspicious. Here's Trump. He includes a video of him chortling about Bezos' divorce earlier this morning. That would have been mid last week. I think he's dressed to go on his way to Texas there. Trump on the Bezos affair/divorce. I wish him luck. It's going to be a beauty. And if there's any confusion about what the implication is here, because we didn't provide a great deal of context here, is the President of the United States, one, using his old ally, the National Enquirer, to do yet more dirty work for him, even though they've already got themselves mixed up in a criminal investigation from which I'm sure they'd like to extricate themselves? Two, is it possible that the idiots at the National Enquirer think that their immunity is more general than it really is, or that it wouldn't blow up the deal that they have? And it might not. But more to the point, I guess what Josh is trying to imply here is that the president might be using his dirt-digging connections to take down Jeff Bezos because he's angry at getting covered in a negative light for his many crimes and treasonous activities by the Washington Post, and that he would ruin the life. I don't really care if you ruin the life of a billionaire. I guess I can't be too sad about that. But it's an extraordinary thing to be doing as President of the United States. And it could only get more extraordinary. The only way it could get more extraordinary is if he actually used the power of the government to do this, and I'm not entirely certain that that is beyond him. And I guess we'll see how things play out this week. It's just one more thing to keep an eye on. Here's more things to keep an eye on. If you can't keep an eye on them, Justice is keeping an eye on them for you over at the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's see. By hiding his conversations with Vlad from senior officials in his own administration, Trump helped Putin destabilize the United States. That's absolutely true, and it's only getting worse with every passing day. There's more I'll tell you about after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
How about these? A federal judge blocked the Trump administration's rollback of the Obamacare mandate that protected contraceptive coverage in 13 states and Washington, D.C. And I'm going to skip down here to the bottom here, where Camp Pendleton in Orange County, California, was such a hotbed of KKK activity that black Marines were arrested and Klansmen quietly transferred.